Greetings, traveler. You've wandered into a gentle corner of time. Sit back, make yourself comfortable, close your eyes if you like, and let your mind drift through the mists of history. I'll tell you a story. Today, we follow a man who was never meant to be remembered. His name was Thomas of Ely, a royal messenger in the service of King Edward I of England. The year is 1298. The kingdom is uneasy. Wars rage in Scotland. Taxes rise at home, and powerful lords grow restless. Thomas left no legacy in stone, no mention in the chronicles of battle or court. Yet he was the thread that held the realm together, riding between castles and crowns, carrying the words that moved men, coin, and war. History remembers the kings and their victories, but rarely the men who carried their words. Today, we ride with one of them. At sunrise, the gates of Rochester Castle opened to let a lone rider through. He wore a dark woolen cloak, a short sword at his side, and across his chest, a sealed leather pouch, the king's mark still visible on the flap. His name was Thomas of Ely, and his task was simple in writing but difficult in reality. Ride north to Lincoln, deliver the king's writ to the sheriff, and do it before the week's end. Inside the sealed pouch was an official order, signed and waxed by royal authority. It commanded the sheriff of Lincoln to muster 100 archers and send them to York within 14 days. Every word had weight. Every delay had consequences. And so Thomas rode. The morning ride through Kent was cold and damp. The ground was soft from last week's rain, slowing the horse's pace. Farmers trudged through fields with their tools, pausing to glance up at the sight of a lone rider bearing the king's emblem. Some bowed their heads out of habit. Others simply stared, suspicious. Royal messengers weren't welcomed as heroes. Often they meant taxes were rising, men were being conscripted, or bad news was coming. They moved with authority and were treated with caution. Thomas passed through Dartford without stopping, save to refill a leather flask and let his mare drink. The horse, a dappled gray named Marigold, had been gifted by a noble house in Canterbury. She was light, fast, and steady everything a messenger could hope for. Time was always pressing. A day lost could spark a military delay or political misunderstanding, and so he pushed on. Near midday, Thomas reached the Thames crossing at Woolwich. The ferryman grunted at the sight of him, barely hiding his distaste for the seal. "Another order from the Crown?" he muttered as the ferry pulled them across the wide, brown water. "Tell the king we've no grain left to give." Thomas said nothing. A royal messenger was not a negotiator. He was not a judge. He delivered the words of others, never his own. Silence was his safety. By late afternoon, the skies turned gray. Rain began to fall first in mist, then in sheets. The roads near Waltham became slick and dangerous. Marigold slipped once in a rut, nearly throwing her rider. But Thomas didn't curse the rain. He cursed time. Every moment in the mud was a delay, and delays were dangerous. That night, he stopped in Stevenage. The town's inn was warm, smoky, and crowded with travelers and local farmers. The innkeeper nodded at the sight of the seal, but asked no questions. Over stew and ale, Thomas listened. Rumors of outlaws near Sherwood. Stories of men in green robbing the king's tax wagons. Some said they were heroes. Others called them murderers. Thomas did not ask for the truth. He'd heard too many versions before. Every road had its legends, and every legend began with someone who had nothing to lose. He rose at dawn, ate quickly, and was in the saddle before most were awake. The second day was harsher. North of Huntingdon, the roads grew narrow and riddled with deep cart grooves. Fewer settlements now, more open land. The wind picked up. A boy near a roadside hut threw a rock at Marigold, hitting her flank. She jumped sideways, but Thomas stayed in the saddle. The boy's mother shouted at him to stop, panic in her voice. A royal messenger could respond with force. He had the king's protection, but Thomas didn't even look back. To many, he was just another hand of a crown that took too much. By the afternoon of the second day, the land began to shift. The hills of Lincolnshire rolled ahead, wide and windswept, dotted with sheep and the odd manor in the distance. The roads straightened here, firmer and more traveled, winding their way towards something larger. And then he saw it. Lincoln. It rose from the horizon, not like a town, but like a monument. Gray stone walls, fortified gates, and at its heart, the cathedral Lincoln Minster, towering above the city like a spine of carved rock. To a royal messenger, cities were not destinations. They were interruptions. But still, Lincoln was something to behold. At the city gates, Thomas reined in Marigold and called out his business to the guards. They were in no hurry, dressed in worn mail, spears in hand, their faces showing the kind of boredom only gate duty could bring. But when Thomas pulled aside his cloak to reveal the wax-sealed leather satchel across his chest, their posture shifted. One of them stepped forward, narrowed his eyes, and inspected the seal. "King's writ?" the guard asked. Thomas gave a simple nod. No need for talk. The seal spoke louder than he ever could. The guards exchanged a look, and one of them disappeared behind the portcullis. A few moments later, the great wooden gates groaned open just enough to let the rider through. No cheers, no banners, just the sound of hooves on stone as Thomas entered the city of Lincoln. Inside, the city pulsed with late-day life. Vendors shouted from beneath wool-covered stalls, carts rattled over uneven cobbles, and children darted through narrow alleys between timber-framed houses. But Thomas had no time to wander. He rode uphill, always uphill. Lincoln was steep, a city built on layers, and the sheriff's hall sat near the top. The closer he got, the quieter the streets became. The noise of trade faded, replaced by the echo of hooves in an area that belonged not to merchants, but to officials. At the entrance to the sheriff's hall, he dismounted, stiff from 2 days in the saddle. A steward met him, an older man in a dark wool robe, with narrow eyes and a jaw clenched in habit. "You ride for the king?" Thomas handed him the sealed satchel without a word. The steward took it like it weighed far more than parchment, then disappeared inside, motioning for Thomas to wait. Royal messages could not simply be handed over like letters between friends. They had to be witnessed, recorded, and opened in the presence of those who had authority to act on them. So Thomas waited. He stood in a small stone chamber, warmed only by a dying fire, as officials assembled in the next room. His cloak dripped rain onto the floor. His boots, once firm, now bent with wear. At last, a door creaked open. A younger servant motioned him inside. The sheriff of Lincoln stood at the head of a long table, 2 clerks at his side. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a fur-lined robe over a mail shirt, as much a soldier as an administrator. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind. Thomas stepped forward and bowed slightly. The sheriff gestured to the table. "Let us see what His Majesty requires of us this week." One of the clerks broke the wax with a small iron blade and carefully unfolded the parchment. His eyes moved across the page. Then he passed it to the sheriff. The room was quiet for a long while. Finally, the sheriff looked up. 100 archers for York, he said. Before the next moon. He exhaled through his nose. He must be planning something. Thomas said nothing. He never commented. It was not his role to speculate, just deliver. The sheriff gave him a nod. "You'll want food, a bed. You've come far." Thomas gave the smallest nod back. He wasn't a man of thanks, just movement. That evening, Thomas sat alone at the table reserved for traveling officers and crown servants. A fire crackled in the hearth. A clean tunic had been left for him. Marigold was being stabled and brushed by one of the city's own boys in a stall meant for royal horses. He ate slowly bread, boiled meat, and dried fruit. His hands, still stiff from the reins, were beginning to relax. There would be another message, no doubt. Another road, perhaps west to Oxford, perhaps north to Berwick. He would learn soon enough. But for now, just for the night, the kingdom could carry on without him for a few hours. Thomas stayed in Lincoln for 2 days. The sheriff's scribe prepared another dispatch, new orders to be carried west to Shrewsbury. A shorter ride, but through harsher ground. He would leave at dawn, just as before. There was no ceremony, no payment beyond the king's stipend, no time to rest longer than needed. His boots were resoled, his satchel checked, his cloak dried and folded. Then, once again, the saddle. For men like Thomas, the end of one message was only the beginning of another. Messengers like him left no legacy in the pages of history. Their names rarely appeared in chronicles. They were not builders or rulers. They were bridges, living threads between men of power. Every order given by a king required someone to carry it. Every alliance forged, every army raised, every castle warned, none of it moved without someone willing to ride. Thomas of Ely was one of many, alone, unthanked, and unseen. And on that long road between orders and obedience, they rode not for glory, but because someone had to.